Oh, cool. Tonight it is a strictly family affair at Novara HQ, and I'm joined by Tisky Sour, top lads, the good doctor, Aaron Bastano.
Thanks for giving me the Butters chair. This is the one with the poor lighting.
You actually look really buff. I wouldn't lie to you.
Well, this is before I've sweated about 3 litres because of the fact that we, for some reason, have a sort of microclimate in the Novara offices.
We have like a full-on sauna here. We're going to like whip each other with birch twigs and roll in the snow afterwards. And also, wouldn't be a Tisky Sour without the indomitable, the peng, Michael Walker.
I didn't even know what that first adjective meant, but I hope it's positive. I'm a bit worried today because last time I had kitchen roll next to me that I could wipe my forehead every time the camera went away. Okay.
Yeah.
I couldn't see that until like the last 10 minutes.
No.
It was really bad.
So, why are we here? Not just to dab at ourselves with a bargain store kitchen roll. We are here to discuss just what the fuck is going on in Westminster. Because this morning the nation woke up still a bit sun-drunk and booze-groggy to find that our esteemed Secretary of State for exiting the EU, David Davis, had resigned from the government's front benches at 11:30pm.
You must have had a nice early night, Ash. Have you found out about that in the morning?
I did. I went to sleep at like 10 last night because I was seriously like, I drank a lot of rum in the sunshine.
Fair enough.
I was booze-groggy when I woke up is what I'm trying to say. And he'd done turns to camera, a Dex U midnight runner. Eh? I nicked that joke off Twitter, so if none of you find that funny, it's someone else's fault.
Blame the original poster.
Blame the original poster, whose name I have conveniently forgotten. So, David Davis, sentient home pride cartoon. His resignation is a huge blow to Theresa May's much vaunted Chequers agreement, which had managed to restore cabinet collective responsibility and finally come out with a unified government Brexit negotiating position with the EU for a princely 48 hours. I mean, that was, longer than Sam Allardyce's tenure as England manager, shorter than, the average Brittany marriage? Or was that 72 hours?
How many times? Oh, what was it, a Vegas one?
Yeah. It was either 17 or 72.
How long was Allardyce the England manager?
64 days.
I think I either saw his last England game or Southgate's first one at Wembley.
I only discovered football in the World Cup 2018. I'm a semi-expert now, but anything that came before 3 weeks ago is alien to me, so I don't know.
I mean, we all feel that way because there's been a flurry of political activity today as well, so feeling a bit punch-drunk.
That's true.
With Davis's exit, swiftly followed by Parliamentary Under-Secretary Steve Baker, speculation was rife as to which of the arch-Brexiteers would follow him. So would it be Michael Gove? Would it be Liam Fox? Would it be Penny Mordaunt? I have learned all these names just for today. It was, in fact, none other than Sir Tufton Bufton himself, Boris Johnson. Number 10 managed to spike news of his resignation by announcing it just before he'd managed to finalise the final Greco-Roman flourishes to his resignation letter. And now he's gone. So, with Corbyn on absolutely lacerating form in the Commons today and reports that Theresa May has been issued with an ultimatum saying that she's got to ditch the principles of the Chequers agreement, otherwise she's going to lose more and more cabinet ministers with each passing hour. Her position as Prime Minister looks, to me at least, to be increasingly untenable. But what is the necessary constitutional choreography to get Labour from just harping on from the opposition benches towards a general election? What are her chances for survival? Do we have any historical analogues that we can talk about? And what is it that annoyed everyone about the Chequers agreement in the first place? But before we go over to hearing from Michael and Aaron, I think we've actually got some footage from Friday of Theresa May celebrating her cabinet consensus. Gary, can we get it?
What was that? Was that Gary at the weekend?
It was Theresa May at the weekend, but also could have been a half-cut Gary.
Where was that? That was the guy that fell through the bus roof, right?
Yeah,
where was that?
I don't know where it was, actually.
It was the stupidest thing I've ever seen.
No, it was in London, wasn't it? 'Cause it's a London bus.
Yeah.
It looked like it was Croydon or something, but I wasn't sure.
Like Oxford Circus.
It's Oxford Circus.
Circus.
Oh my god. He's
Jesus
like he's
Christ.
going to jail as well. How funny. Criminal damage and you've broken your leg.
Well, the thing that May could learn from is it fucked up really badly, really publicly, quite embarrassing. The man got straight up and walked away.
What?
Yeah, but
he saved it.
I know, but he's pretty like coked up.
Oh.
He's on everything, right?
No, but they say if you have a fall and you're drunk, you're more floppy, so you're less likely to break your limbs.
It's true.
Don't try this at home, kids.
So getting pissed is bad if you're in danger of drowning, but good if you're in danger of
falling.
Yeah, falling.
Just as long as it's not
But
falling.
it makes it more likely to fall, so you shouldn't. Don't get drunk in high
Look,
places.
don't scale a double-decker bus and then try and jump onto a bus stop.
But if you do, be floppy.
Be floppy.
Do you know what? Can I just the outrage? Let's talk about something really important here. Put Brexit to one side for a second. The outrage I've seen. What do you guys make of this IKEA stunt at the weekend? People invading the IKEA. It was a few minutes away from a giant screen, etc.
Yeah.
What do you guys make of this? Because in Bournemouth and most provincial towns, this kind of stuff does honestly. I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it does happen pretty much every weekend.
What, people...
Every weekend there's an IKEA riot in
Yeah.
Bournemouth.
Yeah.
We have a long and rich tradition of IKEA riots here in the
People
UK.
doing
but-
like crazy stuff every weekend in provincial towns. Crazy stuff. The English are very strange people.
So the
Very
question is, is it the
very
beginning of
cons-
fascism that we're seeing? Is that
Very
the question
well.
you're
To me,
asking?
it just looks like a. I'm not saying it's good, but it just seems like a continuity, right? They're very conservative institutions in this country, but very odd people.
I mean, it depends. It depends.
Uninhibited people.
It depends what you see as an indication. I mean, I suppose the disclaimer is that it's not a big deal. It was some people who got pissed and jumped on a bed in IKEA. But the idea of
Display bed.
attacking... It wasn't even... The idea of attacking businesses because of their national origin after a football game is not... Who are we playing next? Croatia?
Croatia.
I don't know what Croatian businesses do we have anyway. Imagine we played Portugal and all those Portuguese calves got smashed in Brixton.
Nothing
Not
was
fun.
smashed. Nothing was smashed.
smashed though, I suppose.
I mean, that's a bit.
I don't know. I think that is one of those things where lots of people are saying, well, look, like the staff working there were Muslim, imagine how they felt. They looked kind of like shocked and amused. I think
Yeah.
there's also sometimes like a bit of a projection on the part of people who feel quite alienated by football culture anyway, and then are kind of reaching for a reason to discredit it and kind of invoking the experiences of people of colour in a way which I sometimes find a bit like appropriative. I mean, not in a cultural appropriation kind of way, but like I've noticed it a lot with people who just don't like football being like, oh, it's like made everyone really racist. And I'm like, babe, like people were racist before.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go to like a World Cup or international tournaments either, right? When I go to Spurs, sometimes like, you know, I have problems or I see fucked up stuff, but it doesn't diminish my love for the game or the fact that it can bring people together.
Yeah.
It's created this kind of weird like summer forever vibe. Everyone's just like going up to each other on the street saying like it's coming home. I quite like that. So I just kind of think like the woke brigade needs to like tone it down a few clicks, and if and or when it makes people start doing more racism on the street, well, that also shows the paucity of our anti-racist politics. We just need
Very
to
good
start
point.
kicking the shit out of some racists.
That's a
again.
very good point. Yeah. And how do you feel about the sort of like the supporting Croatia brigade, the sort of
I love Rakitic. Support him.
supporting the far right Ustaze to trigger the Brexiteers.
I think there's a ridiculous position, which is that Britain are qualitatively the most evil country in the world, and so you have to support anyone else. I don't think there's much sort of like historical basis.
Yes, there
for that
is. 2 words, my friend. Coronation chicken.
No, I mean, I'm not saying like we
Salad,
I'm not
cream.
saying we were great, but I don't think it's qualitatively different.
Roiling the 2 ethnic minorities, where it's just like,
But
do you know what they've done to food? This is Huel 2.0. Like,
If you're Scottish or Welsh or Irish, there's just a legitimate tradition, which is anyone but England.
hello,
which I think-
Bangladeshi here.
Is there an anyone but England tradition? For
Yeah.
Bangladeshis?
But the problem is that we don't qualify for the World Cup and the problem is that we're not used to, because we can run, but we're not used to running in contained spaces because we're always running from the TV licensing people. Like, we like that moving target. We like round the alley, zip, gone. And that's why we won't qualify for the World Cup anytime soon. It's racist if you laugh at that.
See, no,
I wouldn't retweet.
the rivalries thing I get, right? The rivalries thing I get, but people are like trying to dress up the rivalries thing as like woke.
Yeah, it's not anti-imperialist to support Croatia, basically.
Yeah. Scots can hate the England team. They can support the other team. Like, I get that's fine, but it doesn't mean that I'm an anti-fascist. Alerta, get the Croatian flag emoji on my Twitter handle. No.
Yeah.
That being said, I do love the Croatian team for 2 reasons. One being Modric, because whenever I see like a former Spurs player doing well at a big club, the way Modric has, or Gareth Bale, it's like when you see your ex getting married on a beautiful Thai beach and doing really well for themselves. And it's like a pang of like jealousy, envy that could be me. So I actually kind of want Modric to
He's won like 3 or 4 Champions Leagues now. 3?
I think 3. And Rakitic, because I got to see him play when he was at Sevilla.
Right.
The season before he moved to Barcelona, I think, and he was excellent. But Brexit...
We're getting dangerously close to some sort of support for Croatia.
No.
However woke that might be, it's not.
I just don't believe in like ethnically denigrating them either. Like, I'm supporting England.
Dejan Lovren is fash. Like, Dejan Lovren is legit fash.
And he missed that penalty for Liverpool. Do you remember when he like bluted it over?
I know what all the teams are called now in the last 4 of the World Cup, but I've got no idea who you're talking about.
Okay, so there's a far right. There's like, obviously, look, there was ethnic cleansing in the country. You know, there are far less Croat Serbs in Croatia than there were before. You know, when it was Yugoslavia. And Dejan Lovren, who's a Liverpool defender, was like singing sort of songs from the Civil War period.
No, I mean,
that's not to denigrate all of them, because Subasic, their goalkeeper, is ethnic Serb. But like you say, Michael, the idea that like Britain, rainy fascism island, all the plucky anti-fascist Croats, it's like maybe, you know, some people are good and some people are bad all around the world. And it's just football. Maybe just fucking relax. Have a week off.
Maybe you can't measure your anti-fascist credentials by not supporting people or supporting people with football. And maybe you should do something about fascism. Kind of wild, but. Let's move on to Westminster, but before we do, can we just say that the Croat goalkeeper, what was his name? He was dog shit in that shootout. He kept going down too early. Did you see?
His hamstring was fucked.
Oh, was it? Okay, yeah. I feel bad for slagging him off now.
His hamstring went in the last minute, and they couldn't sub him off because they'd used all their subs. Anyway,
you know who did sub himself off? David Davis. So, Michael, lay it on me, brother.
It's presumably a really bad look if you do that in football, isn't it?
You can't just sort of like
in the 69th minute just say like, I'm done. I don't back these tactics anymore. I don't have better tactics.
You know who would do that kind of shit was Dimitar Berbatov.
Again, I'm only going to I can pretend.
Played for Spurs, was at Monaco. Now he was slick. Sorry, I can't stop talking about football.
I've actually got a good example of this is in 1982. Well, and I wasn't alive in 1982. The 1982 World Cup, Kuwait was in the 1982 World Cup, and then they were losing like 2-0 or something, and there was a foul, and then this like Emir walks onto the pitch, and he's like, gets them all off, and he's like, I've had a fucking enough of this. He's like shouting at the referee. He's obviously worth like $200 million. And he's like, look, I decide what happens here, fucker. And they all go, it's just, I mean, I guess that's kind of how the Brexiteers must feel, right? Is that like that sense of entitlement, they're not in control of the message. I don't think they're going to be for quite a while, actually.
But what was the deal with the like Chequers agreement? Because the thing is so much has happened in 3 days, including winning a quarterfinal and getting really, really drunk for some of us, which means that all of Friday's goings on were deleted from my brain. So can someone please explain what kind of consensus was broached and then broken at Chequers?
Look, none of us were concentrating on the weekend, Ash. I was combining pride with watching the football, and I was thinking how I could do that visually, but however much I can get into supporting England during this World Cup, there's nothing I find kind of more horrific than a pink England flag. So I didn't go there, I just watched it. It was nice. But you've asked me a serious question about Brexit, which I did research tomorrow. I do know the answer. What do you want to know? You want to know what happened at Chequers?
What happened at Chequers, babe?
So the straw that broke the camel's back for David Davis and Boris Johnson, they've been trying for so long to put the national interest, the interest of the government, before their own strange personal predilections. David Davis went so far as to resist resigning over one of his most deeply held principles, as Aaron was talking about,
very important,
on a previous show. So
it's the cornerstone of his politics.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to see the commitment this guy has to the government and to the national interest, this guy was going to resign when David Davis was wanking at work.
Damien Green.
What
did I say?
You said David Davis. David Davis was going to resign.
Oh, maybe it was a mutual. I mean,
Did you just go out mutual? I am still very Muslim. Can I just remind you all that none of that.
It's a mutual.
Well, mutual. If you a mutual masturbation, because you would feel bad if you'd had a mutual.
Nothing would surprise me.
If you'd had a mutual in Parliament and then your mutual buddy, there's a sort of code I think. If you've done that together,
you stop this because I think there actually may be some veracity in this.
Oh, as in like it might be true, so we'll get sued.
I didn't say that.
Anyway, I think there's
things have been said about certain. I mean,
there's a code.
politicians.
Anyway,
I'm
David
still
Davis
trying to
broke-
get my head around what a mutual masturbation is.
No, I
like,
think I'm pretty sure there's a super injunction out there. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Anyway, David Davis broke the mutual code, stayed in government, even though Damien Green had been sacked.
okay, yeah,
This is a guy who doesn't like to resign. He's, pretty solid.
But he
and
keeps doing this attention seeking. Ooh, I might resign, I might not.
He also had a by-election over ID cards. He's like, I'm anti-ID cards when it was a Labour policy. He's like, I'm going to have a by-election in my constituency. He's like, what the fuck? Everybody's like, what the fuck are you doing? He's a clown. So this is just the latest episode.
He does look like the Home Pride cartoon, right? Yeah.
I mean, it's uncanny. He also looks a bit like the Marshmallow Man in Ghostbusters.
Oh, he does.
The original one. Yeah.
Not the woke one. Not the one with all the women in it.
God, here we go. I'm going to have to delete my Twitter account in the
Okay,
next
right,
24
calm
hours.
down, Milo,
Yeah,
okay?
Deluge of hate.
Okay, so he didn't quit over wanking at work. He called a bizarre
I'm just
by-election.
thinking, I'm using all my mental
Okay, look,
capacity to
Michael-
try and link the mutual masturbation to the fact that he resigned over the Brexit being
It was
too
a soft Brexit.
But it was
Soft Brexit.
difficult
Okay.
to do.
It was a soft Brexit.
A
We can
flaccid Brexit.
edit the last 10 minutes. There was a soft Brexit agreed at Chequers, and obviously the people that want a hard Brexit are now very angry.
Yep.
But why didn't he resign just at Chequers then?
So at Chequers, Theresa May sort of was kind of mean. So do you know what I mean?
Hey,
So-
you know what? That's just mean.
Yeah, it's kind of mean. So she doesn't show them the deal beforehand. So they
Yeah.
get there. They're not allowed to bring their advisors. They're not allowed to bring their mobile phones. She sort of 5 hours before the event gives them 150 pages to sift through. She's got Michael Gove on side. So there's sort of like a Brexiteer, Theresa May trying to ram this document through the cabinet. On the day, everyone sort of gives in. Apparently, David Davis is quite quiet and moody, thinking type. But then over the weekend, he's pondering what he's signed up to. He obviously campaigned for Brexit, making a lot of promises about what would be possible. So he said, we can be global Britain striking trade deals with the rest of the world. We don't need to be a vassal state as part of Europe. And if he were to implement the deal that they had made on Friday, that would be him showing through his actions that what he previously promised was not possible. And I think at this point he wants out so he can blame the soft Brexit fudge on someone else. Even though he doesn't have an alternative, I think it's a deeply egotistical move, which is to say the government's had to come face to face with reality. They're going to have to make a bunch of compromises. These compromises are not consistent with what I've rested my whole political career on. So what I'm going to have to do is resign and pretend that when it goes in a direction I said it wouldn't, it's because of betrayal, not because of economic and political realities.
Yeah, I mean, what you're getting now is, was it 17.4 million people voted to leave? And what you're now getting is, this is not the Brexit these 17.2 million people voted for, which is obviously, it's complete nonsense. There's a democratic mandate to leave the EU. Pretty broad ranging what that meant. I mean, we can be charitable to the Brexiteers. I mean, it clearly means changes to freedom of movement. Which was a clear red line over the weekend, because Theresa May basically was like, we'll keep freedom of movement, but we'll not call it freedom of movement. We'll call it, the movement arrangement or something ridiculous.
Well, it says, in the document it says end freedom of movement, but we'll have some kind of labour mobility.
Yeah, and then they call the single market, what do they call it again?
The facilitated customs arrangement.
But there's
That's
another
the
one.
customs union.
Oh, that's the other
A
thing.
shared rule book.
Oh, shared rule book.
We'll have a shared rule book. And it's like, that's what we have.
But
So-
only for goods.
There was a bunch. Well, yeah, but that's great for the EU. If you're the EU, that's great. Because obviously we're a net exporter of services, we're a net importer of goods. It would make our trade deficit even worse. But for the likes of Germany or whatever, it's fabulous because they import our services and they export manufactured cars, for instance. But clearly, that hardest of hard Brexit was never politically feasible, and so now we're seeing that kind of play out. But what's interesting is that I even amongst Brexiteers, I don't think there's a mandate for what these people now want to pursue.
What do you mean by what people? The government?
Canada,
or
no, people like David Davis,
Okay, right,
who I
yeah.
presume want a Canada-style agreement, a trade deal with the EU, Canada plus, end of freedom of movement. They want to keep city passporting rights, yada, yada, yada. Most people know, I think, there'll be a rump, maybe 20% of the country who'll be like, yeah, sick. Most people know that's not feasible. And they know there has to be some, even though we are leaving the EU, there has to be some, at the moment, there has to be some compromise with the other 48% of the country, but also people who voted Brexit who don't want, by all standards, the hardest of hard Brexit. So yeah, it's an interesting time. Where it ends up, who knows?
I mean, so in terms of this thing at Chequers, there were two things that I found quite interesting about the outcome. One was the reports of dissensus and disquiet in the room itself. So Boris Johnson saying, this is polishing a turd, it's a big turd. For all his like famous Etonian rhetorical skills, he just apparently kept saying the word turd a lot. But ultimate capitulation when he was there, same with David Davis. And something that Stephen Bush was saying was quite interesting. So this was something I was reading this morning, which is that a lot has been made about the ministerial cars, right? That if you resigned, you'd have to walk a whole mile down a driveway and then call a cab company which didn't exist and, you know, would just long you out. But probably the more important thing was that these ministers were being presented with a great deal of information without anyone to help them understand it or metabolize it. And particularly with David Davis, you know, he is just a large potato. Like, he can't take on any new information or process detail in any way. Like, there is a, you know, distinct probability that he simply didn't understand what he was agreeing to till he gets back to his department and his support network, most likely Steve Baker, who are going, what the fuck are you doing, man? So yeah, they truly are a bunch of clowns. But what happens next from here? So with Boris Johnson's resignation, I think lots of people are saying that this is the first time since 1979 there's been a resignation of two cabinet ministers
on the same
24 hours. Which is a huge deal, right? Because when we're thinking about 1979, we're not just thinking about a crumbling political order. We're thinking about a whole paradigm shift, right? And potentially could be that moment for the Labour left. I don't think that we're quite there yet. But what's next? What happens after Boris Johnson goes? If you were an arch Brexiteer, what would you be trying to engineer?
Do you want to start with that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a few variables missing for them to have their ideal scenario. So there's no force to the right of the Conservatives to push the mainstream media towards their sort of end of the spectrum. So you haven't got Nigel Farage on BBC Question Time every week. We probably do. It's every fortnight now. You haven't got UKIP polling 15%. So the fact that there isn't an outrider for Conservative Brexiteers, I think, poses them significant challenges where there is a clear spectrum of opinion to, you know, to the Remain side of them, so to speak. So I think they have a problem in that regard. And I think people are just tired. I think, you know, it's been 2 years, and by their own standards, they failed to really do particularly much. I was listening to an interview today between Ian Dale and David Davis on LBC. I mean, nobody can be fucked anymore. I mean, it's kind of crazy. So I guess it's about appetite. And somebody was tweeting about, oh, Boris Johnson's doing this. Not Boris Johnson, sorry. David Davis has done this to steal a march on Boris Johnson because he wants to be Prime Minister. David Davis does not want to be the Prime Minister. David Davis likes to look important. He likes the ministerial cars. He likes the nice, expensive dinners, and he just wants to fuck about. He doesn't want a proper job. So, and I think that counts for quite a few of them. I think Gove would quite like to be Prime Minister. Maybe Boris. I don't think he's got it in him. I think Penny Mordaunt would like to be Prime Minister. I think Andrea Leadsom would like to be Prime Minister. But it's a real clusterfuck. So the only thing that is sort of in their favour is the fact that Jeremy Corbyn is the leader of the opposition. If it was Owen Smith or Tony Blair or Gordon Brown, we would have had a general election already. I mean, we could have said that multiple times this year, and I think it's true. The point is, there is not a continuity party for the British establishment on the other benches.
I mean, that seems exactly like right. I mean, I don't think there is the parliamentary arithmetic to either bring down May or to bring down the government. It doesn't seem like this was part of a well-oiled plan where these two resignations would lead in sort of like a designed series of events to bring down Theresa May. There isn't a majority within the Tory party who would prefer any other single candidate. So it seems unlikely that's going to happen. What seems more likely to me is, Boris Johnson and David Davis don't have any plan for how they are going to ever enter government again, but they'd prefer to be on LBC sort of talking about these big ideals that they once had about how we're not being ambitious enough. And it's nice because they get to go on TV and they never have to do a plan. They're clearly not very good at plans. You know, they're not very good at the nitty-gritty detail of politics. They're both spent in terms of their careers. I mean, obviously at one point, both of them wanted to be Prime Minister. I think it's over now. So I think they'd prefer to retire from the current front bench and be big characters. I mean, for the future of British politics, what's interesting is that now there is establishment and mainstream figureheads saying the government has betrayed the Brexit vote. So before now, there really hadn't been, there were sort of inklings among members of the population, obviously Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage on LBC, sort of saying this is Brexit in name only. But all the big dogs, because they were in the Conservative cabinet, this was the one sort of intelligent thing that Theresa May did. Even though it hasn't really helped her government survive, it did shut them up a little bit.
For 2 years, right? It's quite an achievement.
For 2 years, yeah. So now they're going to be off the leash and they can be out with their big flamboyant egos, booking themselves on TV shows saying the government is not being ambitious enough, the 52% are being sold down the river. And if that builds up a significant sort of popular support for a party to the right of the Conservatives, or sort of is threatening enough to because that's how the Tories shifted to such a Eurosceptic position, because there was UKIP challenging all these MPs in their constituency. So if that can re-emerge again, we could see a harder Brexit. I mean, I don't think the timing works for them, because that's a long-term game.
I mean, I'll just say quickly as well, David Davis and Boris Johnson have literally achieved nothing in politics.
Oh, Brexit.
No, as ministers, like Boris Johnson in 2010 to 2015 government, Boris Johnson wasn't anywhere. He wasn't in the cabinet. He didn't have a serious job. David Davis wasn't anywhere in government. They didn't have a ministerial brief where Michael Gove transformed schools in this country, for worse, obviously. Grayling and Hunt have made huge reforms to the NHS. They've not done something substantial like that. Neither of them, these old fucks, these old, weirdo crank men, have actually achieved anything as national ministers. So the idea that they're going to go out there and now, redetermine a national conversation, they'll go on the sofas, they'll go on the Today programme, they'll chat breeze with Ian Dale, but I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of actually delivering a really concrete political transformation, which is what that kind of hard Brexit would have to be. I don't think they've got it in them. There's nothing on their political CV that suggests that.
I mean, I think that in more competent hands, hard Brexiters could present a legitimate political threat, which is constructing a programme which is not much more than ultra-nationalist rhetoric and a realignment of Britain geopolitically and geoeconomically towards America. I think that in more competent hands that could happen. But you're right, they're clowns. And Boris Johnson in particular, I think, has frittered away any illusion of credibility that he may have once had just because people are impressed by a posho who knows like some bits of Latin. I'm not talking about James Butler. He's not a posho. He's not here to defend himself. I'm so sorry.
If he's watching, you can comment
and just be like, "Fuck you, Ash." But yeah, because I think people there is that instinct of deference in British political culture, and I think that Boris Johnson has exhausted that, even something which I thought was impossible. But there has been a lot of talk about things like a no confidence vote, a possible leadership election within the Conservative Party. And I'm still unsure about what the choreography is towards that. And if that is just sort of hype amongst the Westminster lobby where there really isn't an appetite for it within the Conservative Party. So there were rumours flying around that there would be the 48 signatures needed to handed to the 1922 committee.
That's right. We'll do the procedural nitty-gritty.
Yeah, let's do some procedural nitty-gritty, because, listen, I'm watching Love Island, and, that is truly a lawless place, no rules.
Yeah, but I went on Wikipedia this afternoon.
Right.
Hey. So... I
was doing my makeup, just to sweat it off.
A leadership challenge can be triggered if 15% of Tory MPs I literally haven't even put it in my own word, May's Conservative Party.
wait, that's a footnote.
Yeah.
Citation 9. Oh, God, sorry.
15% of Tory MPs have to send a letter to this 1922 fella. And
committee, babe. It's a committee.
Yeah, but that's the chair of the committee, and we call him the 1922 fella. And so they have to send a letter to say, we want to trigger a vote of no confidence in Theresa May. They've probably got enough people to do that. There's 48 of them. But if they have enough, there's 48 people who want to get rid of Theresa May, basically. But if you trigger a no confidence vote, you've also got to win it. And there's little suggestion that May would lose a no confidence vote, because even though she's not particularly popular in the Conservative Party, there's no other unity candidate or any candidate that could get more than 50% support. So it seems like we might have a no confidence vote. She'll probably win it. Yeah.
I mean, what
Not
would
the
that
most
do?
dramatic event. I mean, she might lose it.
I don't think she'll lose it. Do you think she'd lose it?
Well, no, the thing is, I've seen a few sort of journalists say, well, look, this doesn't really change anything. I think most Tory MPs, as with most Labour MPs, the majority of parliamentarians, most of their constituents, or, the voters in their constituencies, voted Leave. So there will at least have to be the sort of appearance of backing a Brexit. This is obviously going to be contingent on where those seats are, right? Anna Soubry's in less trouble than Jake Barry. Both ultimately irrelevant people. But even if the Conservatives aren't in power for the next 25 years, these people want to keep their seats. So I think there will have to be a significantly higher number than 48 of them showing displeasure at the May agreement. Is it enough to get rid of her? Probably not. But I think it's probably, it might be double the 48. And that's quite a lot of people. The thing is, if you're a Brexiteer or you're in a big Leave seat and you're then backing a deal which the leading Brexiteers who've got the sort of biggest brand recognition with the electorate have walked away from, your career could be over. So I think it is significant. I don't think she'll go, no. But I don't think a general election is very likely. I do think a replacement of leader is likely. Maybe not immediately, but maybe before the end of the year. And I would imagine maybe a Penny Mordaunt character should be good. She's got a relatively safe seat in Portsmouth North. I think maybe 10,000 majority. Younger, good speaker, helps when you're, succeeding Theresa May. Pretty clean skin in politics. You could say all these things about Amber Rudd. Of course, her majority is about 400. So I think...
And also not really a clean skin, right?
No.
Widely discredited as not just a liar, but an incompetent liar.
Okay, let me rewind. Amber Rudd, 12 months ago.
Yep.
She's kind of like a little Amber Rudd's mini-me. There's a few like that. Leadsom, of course, certainly not a clean skin. So I think
Not
Penny...
tenable.
Penny Mordaunt...
Truss?
Maybe.
She's great on
weird.
Instagram.
Maybe. There's a great...
She's not, by the way, but she does try.
There's a YouGov. There was a YouGov poll out today, and I tweeted it. And the way that YouGov reported the raw data was interesting. They say, a slight majority of Tories want Theresa May to leave either immediately in a year's time or straight after Brexit, which is basically sort of about 57% of Tories want her to leave in the next 18 months. What was interesting was only 28% of Tory members want her to stay. 28%. So again, it just goes back to under normal conditions, none of this would be tenable. But of course, the alternative is Jeremy Corbyn.
I think in the short term, Theresa May is not under, as in the short term, as in like the next 2 weeks. I don't think she's going to lose a vote of no confidence unless some sort of master plan emerges from behind her and someone shows more immediate leadership than we've seen so far. But the crunch moment is going to be when she has to win a parliamentary vote on the Brexit deal that she comes back with in October. If she does come back with a deal in October or November is when they're going to vote on it.
3 months, right? Yeah.
And so at that point, 48 Conservative backbenchers would really matter. So they could potentially, the European Research Group could...
Of whom there were 62 signatories on that ransom letter.
Yeah, so in February, 62 members of the European Research Group signed a letter to Theresa May saying that she was going too soft on Brexit and they wanted her to stand firm to some hard Brexit red lines. I could get them up, but we can imagine them, can't we? Just imagine those. And they could, they could defeat that. And so that's why lots of people are saying now that Theresa May's premiership will rely on her winning over a number of Labour rebels. So we can assume plan, partly for political reasons. They obviously need to vote against the government on the biggest issue of the day, but I think also for practical reasons. So one of the powers that Theresa May is going to be very willing to give away to the EU are on things like state aid. So it was said very explicitly in that Chequers agreement that we will happily let the EU sort of determine rules on what aid, what support government can give to businesses, because that's not only acceptable to Theresa May, who doesn't have much plan to implement ambitious industrial policy. It's almost attractive for the Tories because that can be used to restrain a future Corbyn government. So there'll be plenty of reasons for the Labour front bench to vote against that deal. I think what Theresa May is going to try and do is have some of the multi-centrists on the backbench of the Labour Party voting with Theresa May in the national interest. And on the on the most moderate and the level that we normally see in Parliament, that would involve sort of like 20 to 40 Labour MPs saying, we're going to vote in the national interest with Theresa May's deal. They'll probably call Jeremy Corbyn irresponsible. On the more ambitious one, you could see some sort of national government. So if Theresa May loses the confidence of enough Tory backbenchers who really want a super hard Brexit, and those Labour rebels are sort of saying, like, we could vote with you, but, I mean, you might have noticed we haven't had many opportunities for promotion recently. We kind of want a political future. For us to save your premiership, can you invite us into government? That would be the most dramatic way
and
that
we'd
she could
obviously
get that through.
We'll need a change of PM, right? I think that would be the price.
Yeah.
But it'd be purely cosmetic and more or less in terms of the national agenda. But then look, then you need to ditch the DUP. Is Chuck Rumminer going to go into... I mean, I don't rate the guy, I don't like the guy, but is he really going to go into government with the DUP?
So what I think with people like Chucker is that they don't want to be in the Labour Party anymore. They want to form a centrist party. And they can either form sort of like a centrist party as a fringe group with sort of, at best, 6 MPs, because most of them would lose in a general election if they stood as independents.
Right? Yeah.
Probably all of them, but like at best 6. I think probably Chuck would lose his seat. But if they manage to enter into some sort of like formal national government alliance with the Tories, then when they stand, they've got a greater chance of winning. They've got a bit more status. And potentially, if she's invited them into government, if they've had a junior ministerial position, then if they do lose their seats at the next election, it's easier for them to get a job because it's better on their CVs. So I think people like Chuck Ramuna
Mystic Michael
might sell out the entire Labour movement
There's not enough of them, right?
for 3 months' work experience before a general election.
You're going to need like 30, 40, 50 people to do this.
It depends how many of the Tories, I suppose, because that's going to be distasteful to quite a lot of the Tories, this sort of like cross-party national government. Unless you see some mega realignment in Parliament between sort of like centrists, soft Remainers, hard Brexiters, and the Labour Party.
I love the idea of a Ramsay MacDonald sort of Mark II. Like, say, very dramatic. It seems implausible.
I mean, so the question that I wanted to ask you is that if you're Jeremy Corbyn or one of his advisors, is what would you be advising him to do? Because he was on great form today, and that kind of killer line was, if you can't govern, then make way for those who can. But it always seemed to be stopping short of using words like general election or no confidence vote, and so it seemed to me to be avoiding the actual mechanisms by which you can have a change of government. And we know that the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which is, I think, the biggest piece of Weissman legislation to like clog up our law books, fuck you, Nick Clegg, is a huge stumbling block in that regard. So we're kind of wargaming lots of different potential outcomes. I think that this piece of legislation does make it easier for there to be a kind of, significant number of Labour MPs to cross the floor and go in some kind of weird unity government, as Michael was saying. But if you're Corbyn and you're having to manage a significant number of Remain rebels within your own party, a much smaller number of Labour leavers, and you're trying to bring down a government at the same time, how would you go about beginning that choreography? What is the first step in that direction? Because the problem with a sense of parliamentary inertia, a great deal of freefall, but not very much rock bottom to hit, is that you lose, no pun, momentum, or that sense of, an emotional tie to change coming and just being around the corner in terms of the electorate and people who will want to go out and campaign for you. What do we do?
I mean, I'm probably the wrong person to ask, because I'd say, introduce mandatory selection and get rid of half your MPs.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think...
It's your answer to everything. I'm like, Aaron, what do I wear on a first date? He's like, mandatory reselection.
In terms of what would be the best public relations move, in terms of sort of like boosting Labour in the polls, basically, I think the strongest sort of attack at the Tories at the moment is they're a bunch of massive egos playing politics at a crucial moment in sort of like the future of British economy and society. And Labour are there to step in if they can't get it together. But first of all, we should be demanding they get it together. I mean, we don't need to be. But the official opposition should be demanding that they get it together, because there probably isn't that much public appetite at this point for a general election unless it feels absolutely 100% necessary. So I think the idea of Corbyn standing there looking like a statesman as the Tories all sort of like fight like rats in a sack isn't that bad an idea.
Well, when will
I was
there
going
be-
for monkeys in a barrel. But
Oh, is that
rats
one
in a
as well?
sack- Yeah, I was going for a little bit more absurdity, but you went rats in a sack, which is quite dark.
I'm curious, because I agree with you, obviously, but when will there be appetite for a general election? That's the thing, right? Because we had a referendum in 2014, Scottish independence. We had a general election in 2015. We had the Labour leadership. We had Brexit in 2016. We had a general election 2017. Like, this has never happened before. A serious national referendum or a general election, like 5 consecutive years. Well, this will be the 5th year. Obviously, that betokens a crisis of the British state, our economic model, the final sort of demise of our post-imperial place in the world. Clearly, it's really, really big. And I think a lot of people grasp that now, the profundity of it. So, but when is a good time to have a general election?
Well, I mean, obviously, I think if it looked like a general election was going to happen, Labour would vote for it. But I suppose it's what's the benefit of demanding a general election? Because you demand a general election, it doesn't actually make it any more likely. All you're doing is optics. And I think one thing the Labour Party are probably thinking is that if we put on the pressure, like the more the Tory backbenchers rebel, the more likely you are to have a Corbyn government, that's going to be a benefit to May, basically, because that's the one thing she has to discipline her backbenchers, which is that if they rebel against her, they could be kicked out of Parliament and they'd have who they consider someone to the left of, I don't know, who's Fidel Castro. Let's go for a very obvious left-wing character.
Well, we could have a general election this year. Brexit Mark II referendum the year after. Indie Ref Mark II referendum the year after. This is a moment of crisis to the British state. We might have a fucking election every year for a decade.
Oh my god, I'm defecting to North Korea.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, the idea that people have already got fatigue here, I agree. Of course they have. But, like, it's not stopping.
But you want that to look like the failure of so I think if people see election after election after election, they're going to see there's some kind of crisis in the governing class here. They're not going to be saying, oh, they just want us to have a bigger say. They're going to be saying these people can't get their shit together. And so when there's an election which is a result of the government not being able to get their shit together, you want to have the blame squarely on the government, which I think is probably the game they're playing now, is to say, if we have a general election, it's down to the fact that the Tories haven't got it together. Obviously, if it happens, we'll fight it, we'll win it, and we'll negotiate a much more positive Brexit for the country.
I mean,
and act like adults. But.
So then I have a question in terms of strategy, and I think that, I mean, he's not right on much. There's not much that I agree with him on, but the Peckham McTurninator tweeted me today saying what Theresa May has is tactics, not strategy. I think that's largely true in terms of, like, the goal is clearly just to, like, kind of, you know, get her barely limping carcass over the line of March 2019, and her goals are increasingly short-sighted. But one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of strategy is that if Theresa May's only way to sustain her premiership is to commit herself to the softest of Brexits, Brexit in name only, but you're kind of, selling some key points down the river in terms of freedom of movement, because, like, neoliberals are racist anyway, state aid, because neoliberals don't want it anyway, in such a way that could potentially broker a very delicate balance of interest in terms of some of the Labour right, is that, would it be prudent? Because I know that the general consensus amongst Team Novara media is either undecided on a second referendum or against a second referendum. I'm personally undecided. Would there not be something strategic in putting that on the table to try and keep progressive Remainers and even tempt a couple of Tory Remainers over?
So for Labour to call for a referendum on the deal, basically.
Or saying that if they were to contest a general election, that would be on the manifesto.
So that's what Paul Mason was saying today or yesterday.
That's what
I personally
Uncle
think
Paul going off script.
I think it's a terrible idea. I mean, the only motivation I can see for calling a referendum on the deal is if you actually want Remain. Because, I mean, so you can have 3 options on it, I suppose. Either you have the deal, no deal, and Remain. You could have three options on a referendum and then, like, some really bizarre tactical voting. You'd have to give people a 1 and a 2, otherwise you might end up with some deal that no one really wants anyway. what would Labour campaign on for a start? I mean, I suppose if they were in government, they'd be campaigning on the soft Brexit deal they've negotiated.
Yeah, they're going to have to get that through Parliament themselves,
but
ultimately, right?
But if it's a soft Brexit deal that they've negotiated, then why go to... I suppose you could go to the referendum if you're going to struggle to get it through Parliament. But I think, to be honest, the kind of Brexit deal that Labour would get, which would be a softish Brexit that looks a bit like the shared market, you probably could have a parliamentary majority for. Unless, I suppose, you had sort of like hostile group core who were saying, we're going to vote against it. And then as leverage to get that through Parliament, the Labour front bench had to call a referendum. I think that's the only way it could happen, actually.
See, I think this is where, people who watch Novara regularly will hear me use this line many times. They're probably very bored of it. The Machiavelli line of, it's better to make mistakes of ambition than mistakes of sloth. And I think this is one moment. And I'm averse to a second referendum if it's got the no deal, stop Brexit option. But I would not be averse to Labour having a clear position on soft Brexit, clear lines that would go in a manifesto, and taking it to the country right now. And I think that...
What do you mean having a referendum after they enter government?
No, openly talking about it now. Like, so if Jeremy Corbyn does an event in a Leave seat going, this is our offer, here's why I think you should vote for Labour at the next general election, this is what we would deliver in terms of leaving the EU. I think we're getting to the point where Labour are going to have to do that. It can't just be about waiting. And I don't want to... I'm not Jolly on Morm here. I don't want to shoot my load when it's not necessary, right? Like these fucking Muppets have been doing for the best part of 2 years. But we're getting there now. It's going to happen the next 6 months to a year. Labour is going to have to set out its stall in terms of what it wants to implement as Brexit in government. And I think it is an opportunity to have a bigger conversation with the public about a range of issues and actually put this thing to bed properly. I don't think a parliamentary vote will do that.
Can I tell you what some of my concerns are about a second referendum? And to be fair, I've had these reservations less about the perspective that you've been speaking from, which is getting a mandate, workers' rights, etc., and more about what will it take to stay in the EU, because that's what a lot of my very close friends think. And I've got a personal preference for, keep me in cheap Prosecco, it's lady petrol. But
if we stay in the single market of goods, you can still have exactly the same.
I
just want to get tanked every weekend. Is that too much to ask? But what my reticence on it has been in terms of the Remain position, one is a lack of clear strategy on how to win, but I think that what you've said sounds more plausible. But secondly is that I think for any side that is perceived to be a Remain position to lose the second time around ultimately would be much more dangerous for people of colour in this country and people from other countries as well. Because I think that there is a growing sense in the global north that to be on the side of more immigration or more progressive immigration policy is always going to be directly antithetical to the will of the people. And I think that that's a really dangerous territory that Britain is currently in anyway. Right, as with I think most countries in the global north. I think if you then couple that with a narrative about, well, not only is there this kind of plot to have more immigration or more progressive immigration against your will, but now they're directly aligned with some kind of political interest which is at the top to subvert the will of the people as had been laid out in 2016. I think that experientially puts us in a really dangerous position. And I think that one of my thoughts today, kind of going over and over, like this kind of, Westminster sped up Pinter play, has been that actually these big social shifts, the stuff of politics as emotional affect, hasn't been adequately dealt with by the left in this country. I don't think that we've successfully addressed the question of immigration. We've edged around it a bit. We've taken opportunities like Windrush where we can, occasionally lurched into left nationalism where we don't feel able to do so. But the central question of how do we address racism in this country? How do we decouple this notion of control from the very presence and existence of migrants in this country? Nothing's been done. And until I see either the revival of a left-wing economically redistributive anti-racist movement in this country, or stronger noises and strategy from the Labour left in tackling that, I would think that calling for a second referendum is too great a risk to take.
Oh, I agree. The idea that you'd have continuity neoliberalism and a party of the progressive left backing that, I mean, we know it's a recipe for disaster. And if you had that plus like a national coalition of some kind, I mean, it's literally a fast track to if you're the far right historically over the last 100 years, it's fucking kerosene. So you can still envisage, a certain set of variables where UKIP will become highly relevant again. I still think it's very unlikely. And again, I think it's very unlikely because of Jeremy Corbyn. This could have played out very differently over the last 2 years. We could have had Owen Smith as Labour leader. We could have said, well, we're going to remain, and we'd have a second referendum, and it loses 60-40. Labour do lose several dozen seats to UKIP. You can see how it could have played out. I think we've missed that. Going back to your point about immigration, I mean, it's now since Brexit, it's fallen down the list of people's political priorities. Now, the key question is, and I don't know the answer to this, is that because Brexit is just now seen as, that's going to deal with it, so it's just temporarily suspended as a salient political issue? Or being opposed, we still don't quite know as a signifier what it actually meant. Clearly, if you were a progressive, you kidded yourself that, and I don't, or even on the radical left, you kidded yourself that it's just economics. If only we could have a socialist agenda, it wouldn't be so problematic. If you were on the right, you said, well, look, it's because people want a white Britain again. I mean, it's going to be far more complex than both of those stories, right? But we're not quite sure about the extent to what people really meant when they said we want to get immigration down and why. It meant a range of things, including precisely that, right? So I think that's still going to take a couple of years to work out.
I mean,
I don't think it's gone away personally.
I personally feel that Brexit has been a useful floating signifier political horizon for me to draw on rhetorically to talk about why there's going to be a massive change in immigration policy, and leaning into what I know and what I think to be empty rhetoric around global Britain, say, well, why don't we, rather than starting the conversation with protect freedom of movement for EU nationals, which is essentially a white supremacist project, why don't we have a conversation about bringing non-EU migrants up to parity, or starting to think about a more equitable system and distribution of visas, etc., etc. For me, that's been a useful thing to lean into.
Who though? Because that's
in terms of the left.
People on the left, right?
In terms of the left, right? White people don't like me anyway. That's just you, babe.
Oh,
just you and alienating my exes. That's it.
I called someone's ex an asshole on last week's show.
You did.
Who was that?
I don't know the guy.
It was When Do You Lose?
I did it in solidarity with Wendy, but apparently he's really nice.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. Continue.
Apologies to Wendy's ex from the
ex-boyfriend.
whole Novara media team. I'm sure you're not an asshole.
Please go to support.novaramedia.com.
In the words of Slaven Bilic, personally, I don't really care. I don't care if you're an asshole. No difference to me.
I have a bit of a crush on Slaven Bilic.
He used to be really good looking about 15 years ago.
No.
But now
still.
it's a bit...
No, still. It's that kind of... Because one, he self-identifies as a socialist, so...
Oh, really?
Comrade Slaven.
I didn't know
Two,
that.
he's got that kind of stern energy. Do you know what I mean?
He was
that calmness of being a man of a certain age who knows how to iron his shirt.
He was a filthy player.
To go back to migration, I'm going to be brutal. Even though I think that sort of the question about freedom of movement might be helpful as a way into conversations with leftists about migration, I feel like it is too soon to have that argument head on. I feel like Brexit was a wake-up call to the left and the entire political establishment, actually. And I think we got off lightly. In America, their wake-up call that sort of the political establishment had ignored the working class in deindustrializing regions who were told they should accept gradual, slow decline. They should get used to it. The world was not theirs anymore. That was a backlash against that. Obviously, that's not the only people that voted for Trump, but that's who swung it. Exactly the same with Brexit. They were the people who swung it. Those people who'd been told by the political establishment for 30 years that the future is not yours. You have to accept slow decline. That has, in many ways, sort of manifested itself in an anti-immigrant politics. But not only, there's loads of elements to that politics. And I think both Trump and Brexit are a wake-up call that the left needs to re-establish relationships and links with those communities and start taking seriously those demands that these people don't want to accept gradual decline.
Salvini. We could have Salvini in this country. The shit he's saying, like you say, we got off lightly.
Yeah, and we start that project.
Street by street ethnic cleansing.
Yeah, he's another level.
So I think it's ultimately quite a defensive project at this point, which is to sort of say we had been relying on, in this case, a neoliberal institution to defend a policy that we happen to like, which was freedom of Europe, freedom of movement within Europe. Obviously, politically, it has lots of problems. Why is it freedom of movement in only Europe, not the whole world? I mean, I'm not even convinced by freedom of movement in the whole world. I think that could also have politically terrifying consequences in terms of if that leads to a massive rise of fascism in Britain. I'm not sure that when you take government policy out of the hands of democratic institutions, it often works particularly well. So I think, we take this as a wake-up call. I think no one on the left or the right actually has a particularly workable plan for a hard Brexit. I know that the Lexit people sort of say, they generally tell you a history about how the EU is a neoliberal institution. I haven't really heard a concrete plan about how you have a Lexit that sort of builds a socialist Britain that doesn't get much poorer. It's always hard to sell things when you're going to make the country poorer. So I'd go for soft Brexit. Don't piss anyone off any further about sort of like Brexit or Remain. I think let's do a fudge. We do a fudge and then we rebuild our movement, and the unifying thing will be socialism, not the EU.
No, see, I just think that is too complacent, because I think already within
That's going to be pretty hard, to be honest.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just saying let's make it harder. Because, and I guess I'm coming at this from a slightly different perspective, which is first and foremost, before I'm a communist, before my investment in this iteration of the Labour project, first and foremost, my politics are anti-racist. And I've never made any apologies for that. It starts from how I got politicised to subsequent interactions with the anti-war movement, Palestine solidarity, etc., etc. It's always come from a position of recognition of racialized exclusions from the institutions that confer social life, is a really fancy way of putting it. And what I worry about is that in this fudge and in that space of not having an anti-racist strategy, not even saying, well, okay, it's a fudge for so long, but like then we're going to do this, this, and this, or like this is how we're going to engage these questions down the line, is that is read by the forces of xeno-racism, which are very much in the ascendant, as ground for them to take. And I think
are they in the ascendant in this country, do you think, compared to 2 years ago?
I think that while it's slid down the list of priorities, I think that there have been huge capitulations to the notion that immigration itself, decoupled from issues like housing stock, decoupled from the fact that, wages are falling, it's not immigrants' fault. There's been a huge capitulation that the presence of social and racial others is itself a social ill. And you only have to look at John Humphreys' line of questioning, I think the other week on the Today programme. I forget who he was interviewing. He was like, you don't experience
Blair.
What it's like to be... Yeah, to Blair.
Forgettable guy.
I was just like, listen,
Some politician.
It's like, that episode...
Seen past it.
That episode of Black Mirror where you block someone and then you just can't see them anymore and you hear a buzz? That's how it is with Blair for me. It's like he was questioning him, saying that you are so separate from the lives of average everyday people whose lives are transformed by immigration. They experience the knock-on effects. Is that capitulation, that the logic that it's the very presence of other people that will have a knock-on effect on your material conditions, I think is something which is just an accepted feature of the political landscape now. I think it was higher up people sent a list of priorities 2 years ago because it felt like more of a fight. It's a fight that progressives and anti-racists lost, in my view. And I'm still really worried about that. And what I'm worried about is that when we see this ground, when I talk about the forces of xeno-racism, I'm talking also about forces within the Labour Party itself, which are happy to accept, I think, some level of racialised exclusion from the mechanisms which redistribute wealth and address income inequalities and all the rest of it. We're ceding all that ground. That's not really a progressive socialism at all. It's a white socialism.
I was just going to say something that would get me the worst ratio if I ever typed it on Twitter.
Go on, I'll type it
we'll
for you.
clip it.
I think we need to start thinking about an anti-racist fudge on borders.
I'm all for fudges.
Because
What do you mean anti-racist? What do you mean by that?
You can
What does that mean?
You can have racism as a red line.
Mm-hmm.
So you say sort of like, we as a political project have any kind of racism as an absolute red line, but border controls are not racist. I mean, I know you've done a video where you think border controls are racist.
Right?
I don't think they are.
Well, no, they are and they aren't.
I think they function in a racist way.
I mean, they are.
But I don't think they're
yeah.
essentially racist.
I think the history of them is racist.
Everything's racist, right? No, but I mean, they are and they aren't. I mean, ontologically, the point is to discriminate between one set of people and another. Of course they are, but at the same time, they're so ubiquitous.
But is it on basis of race or not? I mean, for me, racism is when you discriminate on the basis of race, whereas borders, they discriminate on the basis of what political community you're part of.
Yeah, but then you like political communities in this country and the history of borders developing as the technology of governance, those are racialized constructs. And until we do some work in decoupling that, which I don't think is happening, then yes, I do think that borders.
That's exactly what I'm talking about, though. Decoupling borders from racism, which is very different from saying no borders.
Tell me how this fudge works. Also, I'm fully on board with being evasive in some regards. You don't have to, not every day scream no borders, because actually what I want is something that's effective rather than something that's pure. So I'm with you on, in that regard. I don't think you have to go in, wielding your Angela Davis on absolutely every matter. But tell me what that fudge actually is.
To be honest, I mean, I don't think it's that complicated to say, how would you have a policy on borders that isn't no borders? And how do you have a policy on borders which respects that fact that freedom of movement didn't have any democratic support, or didn't have enough democratic support, and have anti-racist policies? I mean, quite a lot of brown people voted to end freedom of movement. I don't think opposition to migration...
They were mostly Gujarati, let's be real.
What you're basically saying is we need more BAME women border guards.
For fuck's sake.
What you're basically...
that's not what I'm saying.
And a pride float.
That's not what I'm saying.
I'm joking. No, look, like you said, we agree here. There are two separate categories in politics. There's the moral and there's the useful, and often there's a tension, and you need to sort of lean in towards one or the other. And I think we probably agree about useful. But you make these points in great. Often I think you're talking nonsense. Then I listen back. And that's a really good point, Michael. So I won't interrupt you again. Sorry, carry on.
No, we should do the breaking news, shouldn't we?
Jeremy Hunt.
What?
Guess his new job?
No. Is it Foreign Secretary?
He's Foreign Secretary.
No!
Who's going to run the NHS?
Who's going to look after the NHS?
Yeah. Who's going to save the NHS now that Jeremy Hunt's gone?
Foreign Secretary. That's a perfectly
that makes sense, though, right?
Sentence in our language.
But he'll turn up to stuff, right? I mean, that's more than Boris. He'll turn up to stuff.
You know what? Like, maybe he's perfectly suited to it because he looks like a newt and he just seems happy to be included at any given time.
He looks like a newt.
He does look like a newt. Don't you think he looks like a surprise newt? Like,
he looks really young for us. I mean, given he's destroyed one of the most precious institutions in this country, he looks great for his age.
He's just I think he creeps around hospitals stealing stem cells and injecting them directly into his neck.
Here's a line from when I was on my phone. If the camera cut to me, I wasn't looking on Twitter or WhatsApp. I was actually looking for this quote.
He was sexting.
He was googling non-racist borders.
And I was like, BAME women border guards pride. Okay, so this is Isaac Deutscher speaking to American students at the height of student activism in the 1960s. Quote, "You are effervescently active on the margin of social life, and the workers are passive right at the core of it. That is the tragedy of our society. If you do not deal with this contrast, you will be defeated." And I think that that for me is the crux of what we're talking about. So I don't want an effervescent anti-racism at the margins of social life. I would far rather, I think we agree with this, right? Yeah. I'd far rather a slightly sort of diluted conversation and get to the very heart of working class life and conversations in this country. And that's not just on the telly, by the way. That's that's in all manner of places, and it's going to take probably the best part of the rest of our lives. So I often think that kind of that effervescence, it does tend to be in major cities, it does tend to be among younger university graduates, that kind of conversation. While I agree with it, I question, and maybe this is what Michael was trying to say in a roundabout way.
The thing is, I agree with you. I completely agree with you. And if I didn't make that compromise on some level, I wouldn't be hustling for Corbyn. I wouldn't have any engagement with the Labour Party at all. Probably, right? But it's because I agree with you. I want to be at the centre of people's political, social lives up and down the country and have anti-racist change emanate from there. What I'm saying is that I don't think
which would be very, very slow, right?
But I don't think that aim is being considered enough or being actively pursued as a goal. At this moment, I think it's being evaded.
What valuable conversation.
That's what my point is. It's not saying that oh my god, Jeremy Corbyn's given up on no borders. Because I think that's a dumb point to make.
To be honest, he might have once believed in it though.
Yeah, maybe.
He probably did.
Probably
3 years ago.
But what my point is that I don't think that that's being considered, because I think that you know, in terms of going back to what the McTurninator had said about the difference between tactics and strategy, I think we've got anti-racist tactics. I don't think we have anti-racist strategy.
I think anti-racism has to become a more central part of the Labour project. I don't think that has much to do with freedom of movement.
Well, no.
I also think it'd be a pretty difficult moment at this point to say we're going to increase migration.
No. But it has a lot to do with Brexit as
refugees.
a political horizon, right? Where Brexit is this kind of, you know, perceived as a moment of break with the past in some way, or a return to the past if, you know, you're made of gammon. But like it does have a relationship, I think, to British imperialism, nostalgia for it, or a sense of, you know, departure, as you were saying, from being in, you know, in this rut of post-imperial malaise. And then thinking about how race has been coupled up with images of national decline and what the decoupling looks like, I think is central to the Labour project. Because also, just at its most basic level, for there to be a hyper-exploitable, racialised class is antithetical to any socialist project, I think. I don't think you can be a socialist to make your peace with that.
Should we take some comments?
Let us take some comments.
I want to take one that was directly a critique of what I just said. Don't like Michael's framing of missionary leftism. We leftists have to talk to post-industrial areas. Some of us leftists are in post-industrial areas. It's a good point. I should clarify. I mean, the way I'm talking about that is that unambiguously the Democratic Party did abandon post-industrial areas. So they used to have union organisations and strong representations in what's now the Rust Belt, and their constituency and sort of like their power bases moved away from those areas. Exactly the same with the Labour Party. That obviously does not mean that leftists only live in the cities, but it means that the big institutions of the left, i.e. the big mainstream left-wing political parties, and to be fair, the left I've been part of, which is the sort of like university campus left until I joined the Labour Party, has been very much focused on sort of like cosmopolitan cities and has basically ignored regions which were once the core of social democratic parties. So, and I don't think the answer is for... the answer is the opposite of dismissing leftists that live in those areas. It's to say we need to bring those into those big social democratic institutions or centre them in those social democratic institutions, which has not happened for 30 years.
I mean, it's indisputable as well. I mean, UKIP had like 120 odd second places in the 2015 election. You know, many of them were in the affluent south, but also many were in the northeast and Labour safe seats. Trump's path to the White House was, you know, it's so funny when you watch the video from, you've got Uyghur from the Young Turks, and he's going 95% chance Hillary is going to win tonight, and then it's like it's going through all the states, and like really by the time he gets to Wisconsin, he's like, I think Trump could win that. And it's like, you know, but then it's going to like Ohio, yada yada yada, and he won it because of the Rust Belt.
This is a good question. Will right-wing media back May's soft Brexit?
Well, the Times will, right? If that's what you mean. Is that right-wing media? It's got a paywall, nobody actually reads it?
Well, the Times will, the Daily Mail won't.
The establishment paper
The Telegraph?
Telegraph will.
You think it would? Yeah, maybe.
Who's the alternative, right, as leader? That's the thing. Who's the actual alternative as leader?
They like stability. I think the Daily Mail quite like to blow stuff up in the same way that Boris Johnson and David Davis do. So I reckon they won't back it, but the Times probably will.
But the alternative now is the Corbyn government, right? That's the thing. I think the Times will back it.
I don't think the Telegraph will.
No?
No. I think that they're in a hard Brexit little rut. I think they've developed a set of rhetorical devices and strange logical contortions to back hard Brexit come what may. I think that they'll continue shooting their dear leader in the foot.
Sounds good.
Matt Hancock has been promoted to the health... It's not called the health office, is it? But anyway, he's
Health
the health
Secretary,
minister.
Health and Social Care.
Yeah.
So, like, do you want to know something weird? Is a few months ago, I was at the NME Awards and I saw Matt Hancock there getting drunk with Stella Creasy. Big buds.
Ooh.
Weird.
Oh, actually, I think there was a Squawk Box story about that.
Oh, was it? Okay. That wasn't me. It wasn't me. I was busy getting drunk on my own terms. But
Well, I don't know anything about Matt Hancock, but Imposters TV says if you can't get any ketamine, listening to Matt Hancock has the same effect.
Sick.
I never liked ketamine. And I probably don't like Matt Hancock if I do some research tomorrow.
Any other questions? Comments?
There was one, can you clarify why the EU is a white supremacist project?
Okay, what I mean by white supremacist project is that trade arrangements within the EU have been at the expense of the development, in particular, of Africa. the freedom of movement has not been freedom of movement for all people within the EU. And we can see that by the way in which borders have been enforced by various member states, particularly thinking of like Hungary, thinking of also Austria here, against migrants coming from Syria. And then we can also think about the enforcement of Fortress Europe and the fact that, you know, really the reason why there hasn't been a tremendous amount of conflict, say, between Italian proposals for change, search and rescue and what the EU is already doing is because largely the same. Let people drown en masse who've been coming through one of the most dangerous overland and then sea routes in terms of irregular border crossings in the world, i.e. through the Sahara, and then being stranded at Libya, often tortured, often detained in tremendously inhumane conditions, and then made the rest of their way in completely unseaworthy vessels. So that's what I mean by it's a white supremacist organisation. I don't think that I mean, I wasn't then one of those people that then could bring myself to vote for Brexit back in 2016. I was a reluctant Remainer, so I had all these critiques, but then had a look at who was on the other side. I was on the tube home one night and I saw these guys wearing the leave.eu badges. All of them like had these like stains around their mouth of like red wine and ports, and kind of like, you know, that kind of corpulent, like half collapsed posture of like, you know, drunk middle-aged men. And then two of them got off and one of them was just sat there muttering to himself, "We're gonna win," and then like called someone like a racial slur like under his breath, like while he was just chatting to himself. And I was like, oh my god, like that's the other side. Sorry, that's a really depressing story to tell about like why the EU is white supremacist, but also why I didn't like leave.
I mean, we can, I think whether it's white supremacist up for debate. I mean, you know, obviously it's a contested term, isn't it? I think it's certainly racist in a lot of its policies. And in terms of its genesis, why did the EU come about? It's because fundamentally, by the early 1950s, it was clear that in a world, United States has a market of 300 million people, not there now, but 150 million, 200 million people there. You've got the security threat of the USSR, you've got China, etc. The former great powers of Europe did not have sufficiently large markets to have multinational corporations that could compete at a global level. So they had to integrate their markets. So with that was particularly pertinent because, of course, their colonial markets were disappearing. And the reason why we joined in 1973 is because it's clear that there are higher rates of growth in Western Europe. It's a far more prosperous market for our exports potentially than New Zealand, India, Zimbabwe. So that's what we do. It's purely economic reason why we go and join it. But also
then tariffs imposed at the expense of developing African and Asian nations.
But it was purely about consolidating European capitalism. It was purely about consolidating European capitalism. That's it. Which, of course, that came out of the vacuum of, you know, the end of colonial empire. So the idea that its genesis is woke or in any way anti-racist is clearly nonsense.
Should we start to wrap up?
I think we should start to wrap up. Yeah. We've got, I guess, one very quick last thing to cover, which is at the end of the week to just sort of pour some cool, soothing water on British politics. We've got Trump's visit. And
I thought you were going to say the World Cup final. But we have got Trump's visit.
We've got Trump's visit. And I don't know about you guys, but I will be at the Stop Trump protest on Friday the 13th, very ominously, under the shadow of the big baby balloon. Because I think it's really important that as many people as possible get out there and make it clear to, you know, the Cheeto-in-chief that his values are not shared by the majority of people in this country. We don't welcome sexual harassers in this country.
I'll be there as well. My final point is going to be mundane but very, very important, which is please go to support I can never say it even though I'm begging all the time. Support.novaramedia.com. We really need your donations to make this possible, so click subscribe or donate. I need to check out that webpage. Both. Click subscribe, click donate. We need your donations to make a left-wing media possible so we can keep doing these shows every Monday, and every time the government gets one step closer to collapsing on its face.
I mean, the thing is, we if there is a general election, we would be doing this sort of stuff every night. We obviously do a range of other podcasts. We'd be doing all sorts of video explainers, etc., etc. It's done to a very high level. I think people presume that because, you know, we're shooting in 4K, although not this, high quality audio, and if there is a delay, it's because it's the first 24 hours of it being posted on YouTube. Relax. People think we've got all the money in the world. We haven't. A lot of it's built on voluntarism. We want to pay everybody in the organisation at least a couple of days a month.
Like, I'm really proud that we pay our articles contributors, because that, for me, was really beautiful, which was to say, like, your work is worth something and we'll be that platform. But I don't think people realise that we don't get paid for this. Like, that's why I wear low-cut tops all the time on
Some
here,
people
man.
freelance
it's just like,
here and there, yada, 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 but primarily it's voluntarism, right?
support.novaramedia.com.
I wanted to say as well about this and about populism and about naming the people. So if you can imagine how somebody could be looking at Britain on Friday and Sunday. Stop Trump demo could be massive. I don't want to jinx it by putting a number on it. It could be huge political statement, which is international news. On the Sunday, an England team, again, touch wood, we might not even get to the final. I think the semi-final's been a success, so it doesn't matter. But, you know, on the Sunday, we could be in a World Cup final and win that. I think France and Belgium are ultimately better sides. Croatia isn't. But again, who knows? With, you know, a very diverse team. Not just diverse because they're multiracial, but also because they come from every region of England, really, which is also equally interesting and important for me. I was kind of happy. Somebody said we've got the back three are all Yorkshiremen and Carl Walker's mixed race. And I thought that's really cool. The way that the framing wasn't that, it was, you know, the region they were from. And a lot of people could look at that and go, wow, what a brilliant place. And I think it's important to do two things. Firstly, yes, that's obviously a great image to have, and we shouldn't denigrate it. And it is, you know, and it is calling into being, naming the people, which is what populism does. But at the same time, not get relaxed about it. Because in a way, it also doesn't reflect Britain, right? The Stop Trump movement has been contested and built and fought for 3 or 4 years ago. You know, that would have been let's say pre-2010, if there was a very right-wing, abusive US president coming to Britain, that wouldn't have happened, right? It's there because the left is historically quite strong. And not just within the Labour Party either, right? Just generally speaking. And simultaneously, if an England team wins a World Cup, you know, that in no way reflects the reality of England. The reason why I celebrate the England team, the reason why I would happily wear a shirt or have the St George Cross in England match, never the Union flag, is that I think they betoken what a minority-majority country will look like. And we need a politics that fits that, because we don't. And if we're going to start rejecting avatars of our future, then I think the left is irrelevant. So support England. And
I'm supporting England because it's just beautiful to see Tottenham finally make it to the semi-finals of something.
Kieran Trippier, best right back in the world.
Oh my God,
what has happened?
Playing so well.
What has happened?
Even Ali came through at the weekend. I was in a pub on Essex Road, alienating this like Gooner pub by like screaming at the top of my lungs, you know, that we've got Ali chant. So yeah, for me it's not about left nationalism, it is about retrenching tribal North London rivalries. But you guys have both been great, and thank you all for watching. We will be here same place, same time next week. Bye. Are we done?